देखो दादी, ये बड़ा होकर ऑमलेट ही बनेगा।
अरे भाई साहब, आजकल सब अपने अंडे का आमलेट बनाते हैं, इसको बनाते हैं स्क्रम्बल्ड एग।
ऑमलेट स्क्रम्बल्ड एग, इसको ना हम कुछ ऑफबीट बनाते हैं, जैसे भुर्जी पाव हैं।
भुर्जी पाव? हमारे जमाने में तो कोले अंडे को उबालना ही सही समझते थे।
MBA, मस्त बॉयल अंडा।
अरे कॉन्टिनेंटल में बहुत स्कोप है, इसे एक बेनेडिक्ट भी बना सकते हैं, समझी?
अरे हमारा पहला अंडा है, इसके साथ कोई भी एक्सपेरिमेंट नहीं करेंगे, अगले के साथ ट्राई।
भुर्जी।
With Bound, writers get to nourish and fuel their creative side. It is our aim to help everyone share their stories and make an impact. We offer writing retreats where our writers get to interact with a community of like minded people and get mentored by India's best authors. Through our writing coaching program, we hone writers' skills and help them complete and pitch their manuscripts. It's not just about a single experience, workshop, or session. Bound is about finding your creative family. Join our community of over 6,000 writers and make your creative dreams a reality.
कितना टाइम लगेगा?
बस एक 5 मिनट लगेंगे।
ओके 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 ओके।
और कितना टाइम लगेगा? बस 5 मिनट लगेंगे।
कितना टाइम लगेगा?
5 मिनट सर।
बस 10 मिनट लो।
अगर आपके पास टाइम है तो हमारे पास एंटरटेनमेंट है। Pocket Films brings you the best of short films online. There's always time for Pocket Films.
इंसी भाई उठ जाए नींद से।
Hey, what's up? Welcome back to stage 2 of the India Film Project Season 10, which is brought to you in association with OnePlus. Our binging partner is Tata Sky Binge Plus, empowered by Bumble, sponsored by Acer Concept D Laptops, Sennheiser, Mubi, along with our X-Innovation sponsor, Fujifilm. I'm so glad to have you back on this stage. My name is Kay, and we're joining you with yet another beautiful session that we have. A reminder that our theatrical release partner is Wakao, and our broadcast partner is MTV. Our partner is also Adobe. I don't know if you've checked this out yet, but I'm going to remind you, if you've not checked out the IFP leaderboard, which is actually live as we speak, each activity you do on this platform that you are on right now gets you points, and the one with the most points takes home a prize of up to $5,000 every day. So go right ahead, make sure you do various things, engage with the platform, because every single small thing you do adds points and puts you on the leaderboard. All right, let's get to this session. Of course, the session that you've seen on the schedule as writing and researching historical characters in popular non-fiction. Now, how does this kind of tie into what we're doing? Well, India's history is in its stories and its characters, right? The people behind the legends and the stage as well. So as a historian, what draws you to these characters that compels you to tell their story? What is the research process that you follow? And how long does it take? I mean, looking at these characters from a historical perspective, but writing them in a way that makes them interesting, relevant, even now is quite a task, if you may say so. But what would you describe as a writing process? Well, to help us out with this, I want to introduce you our two speakers who are going to give you the most enriching session ever. First, I'd like to introduce you to Manu Pillai. Manu S. Pillai is the author of, too many books. Like, Manu, you should really stop. Like, honestly. He's got The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans, and most recently, The Courtesan, The Mahatma, and The Italian Brahmin, which was, if I'm not mistaken, in 2019. That's when it came out. Is the winner of the 2017 Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar Award, and he's also a columnist, was also a columnist with Mint Lounge for 3 years. His other writings have appeared in The Hindu, Open Magazine, Times of India, Hindustan Times, and The New Statesman, and other publications. He's currently studying for a PhD at King's College London. Manu, thank you so much for joining us, and I love the background, I just have to say that. Where you're sitting looks absolutely beautiful, so thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I've staged my background perfectly well.
Okay, so let's get to our next speaker, Sharon Bhatti, who is a former journalist and now a digital content creator, a booktuber, a content strategist, and a culture entrepreneur. She's worked with Mail Today, the Indian Express, Hindustan Times, which is my parent company where I work, Rolling Stone magazine. She's been the co-founder of The Hive and even the Cuckoo Club. By the way, Sharon, I don't know if you know, but I used to do open mics at the Cuckoo Club. And I used to bomb horribly, which I'm sure you've heard from a lot of people. Currently, she's the co-founder of Books on Toast and Shiny Happy Book Club. Sharon, welcome to IFP, and it's so fantastic to have you here. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much, Kay. How are you?
I'm good. We're really, really pumped, excited for your chat. But just getting back to the Cuckoo Club, like I said, you've probably heard that from a lot of people, right?
Yeah, I think every comedian out there worth his or her salt has bombed at some point or the other at the Cuckoo Club.
Yeah.
So I'm glad.
So I bombed and then I stopped. I'm like, I'll do improv comedy now, so I'm done. So, guys, I'm going to hand it over to you. Before we even get your session started, I want you to show, to the people watching this, I want you to show a little bit of love to both our speakers. Drop a yay, Sharon, in the chat, or go ahead and drop a yay, Manu. And without further ado, it's over to you guys.
Yay! I'll just do yay myself. Thank you so much, Kay, for that extremely energetic and enthusiasm introduction. I think you are standing in for all the audience, the energy that's typically there on stage. And we're trying to mimic it in a virtual format this year, which is interesting and strange and weird at the same time. But I'm glad that we are doing this. So hello and welcome to the annual India Film Project Festival. This is our 10th year and our first where the venue is your device, considering, well, 2020 and the deadly attack from a foreign invader. My name is Sharon and I'm your festival curator this year. Extremely excited about today's session to be discussing history in this historic year. I will say history at least 20 times. So if you find it, you actually count down how many times I say history, because Manu will say more times history than I will. So I'm assuming that will be, let's do a game set match. What do you say, Manu?
I doubt I'll end up using history that much, but we'll see. Maybe at the end of this, if someone can keep a tally, we'll figure out who's, more prone to it.
Oh, you're really avoiding the word history quite nicely already. So good job. Okay, so this session is about writing and researching historical characters in popular non-fiction with India's coolest historian, Manu S. Pillai. So Manu, welcome to the session.
Thank you, Sharon. Looking forward to the chat.
Yes. So before we go into the question answer session, I just want to tell everybody how I discovered Manu's writing. It was in his weekly columns for the Mint Lounge that used to come out every Saturday or every other Saturday, where he would present these strange, interesting, sometimes witty, sometimes very tragic stories about ancient, medieval, and colonial India. He's also a lot of fun to follow on Instagram for sharing images and stories of darbars, battle posing, yogis doing yoga with millennial captions and emojis. So bite-sized historical nonfiction. So good job on What Coconut. That's how you pronounce it?
I actually get a lot of flack for these, these memes or whatever that I create, because recently, in fact, somebody messaged saying, don't you think it's an insult to the original artist who created it? For half a second, I wanted to send them like this academic paper on meme culture and how it's actually contributing to the creation of new art in the 21st century. But then I was like, why? I'm enjoying what I'm doing. No need to answer to anybody as to why. But yeah. And it's called What Coconut. The idea was, in our country, we have so many accents. And my late father was, this Pakka South Indian. And every time, we'd get irritated, we'd say things like, what nonsense are you saying? Except that he always said, what coconut are you saying? And I always loved that expression with the accent. And I decided to enshrine it as my Instagram handle. In fact, some people do think I should have a more serious one, but I'm quite happy with what coconut. Let a historian also have a slightly unorthodox handle.
An unorthodox handle it is. So Manu, my first question to you is about 2020, of course. If you were to describe this year to humans of the distant future, what would you tell them? What happened in 2020?
Well, firstly, we all sat at home a lot, which is a very unusual thing for a lot of people who live urban lives in India in the 21st century. To sit at home at a stretch like this, especially in the early months, week after week, just behind closed doors, and we've never felt this kind of panic, right? This is worse than some kind of a war situation as far as sitting at home is concerned. Even I know about my grandparents, about wartime situations. They still had a life outside their four walls. They still had an existence outside. We, I think, are going through a very interesting chapter. It's certainly memorable. It's tragic in many ways. But I have a feeling that, in the years to come, this is going to be something that constitutes a major part of popular culture as well. We'll see a lot of poetry on this. We'll see a lot of songs on this. We'll see all kind of references here and there, from comedy to film to actually films about the pandemic. All of this is going to come. And I think this is like one of those huge highlights that perhaps come once in a century. So we, for better or worse, we're living through history, which is not always a good thing. History is not always, oh shit, I've used the word. So it's not the past, or learning about the past is not always pleasant. It can often entail involve a lot of negative or unpalatable details. But here we are living it, and somehow we're surviving. We're having this festival. Lots of things are starting to spin back into their right places and order. And we're managing to survive what we thought was some kind of earth-shattering event. And that's exactly what human beings do. And that's exactly what people in the past also did. They survived.
Hopefully we will survive this too. So let's talk about your genesis, if I may, and your genesis specifically with history. So why don't you briefly take us through your interest in the subject, and at what point did it become a career option?
I was always interested in stories. And the thing is, I just happened to loop it to historical stories. The idea was, you think of historical figures, we always view them slightly in the abstract. We always forget that people who lived 50 years ago, 100 years ago were also human beings. They were also made of flesh and blood. They also had their weaknesses and strengths. They were also, not some kind of perfect people who exist as our textbooks present them. They had their own problems and conundrums, and they had very human feelings, which includes, greed, ambition, gravitas, all kinds of negative qualities, all kinds of strengths, all kinds of weaknesses, all of this together. Now, I'll give you an example. There's this, we all in our textbooks learn about this big event called the Partition of Bengal, which happened in 1905 under Lord Curzon. And what is interesting is this Lord Curzon is always presented as this absolutely stiff upper lip type English imperialist. He actually did wear a steel gadget to keep his back straight because of a problem. So it gave him this very sort of ramrod straight appearance. And he was considered this extremely unapproachable kind of man. But you actually peel back that layer, remove him from that political context and view him as an individual. And you find a fascinating story, of a man who had a long affair with a married woman and then, wrote all kinds of soppy puppy dog kind of love letters to her. A man who went skinny dipping once and decided to play lawn tennis naked. A man who was able to become viceroy because he married a wealthy woman and her money sort of enabled him to build a profile that was much bigger than he could otherwise have claimed. And a man who had lots of insecurities of his own, and he was not some kind of. So the textbook gives you one monochromatic version, but you peel back and look at that man himself, and you see that he was just another character. He also got drunk. He also traveled to all kinds of places. He went to a brothel. And speaking of brothels, you don't have to go too far. Read Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography. He talks about how, as a young man, he was tempted to go to a brothel. For me, that is really interesting. The fact that these are all human beings. In their own time, they didn't think of themselves as great men and women. They were just living lives as we are now. They went and made, stumbled here, made a few mistakes there, succeeded here, perhaps ended up making history or creating something new and great. But the point is, they also had a process. They also had a journey. And that human quality, that humanness of history is what really interests me. And I learned this first in my own home from a grandmother who never censored anything and told me a lot about my own ancestors and their very human existences, which included, so great-grandfather was never just this idealized figure called great-grandfather. He was a person capable of lots of mistakes and all kinds of random things and so on. And that brings a sense of life. It brings a sense of fun into history. Once you view it not as a thing of people who are not like me, but instead you view it as, oh my God, these are just like me. The contexts are different, but they're also human beings. Then it becomes more fun and more lively.
So was that always a thing that you would always sit with her and she would tell you tales of the story and the family legacy and give you instances of like members of the family who were historically connected but also human?
I think they were not even historically connected. I mean, these people were what I would call petty landlords. They were not like humongous landlords, but they were not, absolutely tilling the land themselves either. Somewhere in the middle rung, which gave them a rather large establishment. What really fascinated me was that whole culture, right? So a village in a colonial era, in that period, it's, you've got the house, you've got people around the house, you've got people tilling, there are the cows, all kinds of stories. Now, for example, one of my introductions to the caste system was, the story that, the bonded laborers, the practically agrestic slaves who actually tilled the land, they were not allowed proper names. So they were given names like tall one, short one, fat one, stone. These are the kind of words that were given to them. They couldn't call themselves Lakshmi or Sita and things like that. But they had to address members of the family as Your Highness or My Lord and things like that. They could never take the given name of anybody in the family. That was the feudal protocol. But the human ingenuity is such that there are always ways to flout this. So one amazing, episode my grandmother was telling me was about her mother and how her mother one day in the distance from the fields, she heard somebody say Kalyani with like great anger. And Kalyani was her name and she knew nobody would dare, take her name like that in public. So she sent out somebody to find out who had dared to utter her name like that so loudly with so much animosity. And she turned out all these laborers, they had gone and named all the farm animals after members of the family. So you could actually hit a Kalyani, you could actually hit a Madhavan, who was my great-grandfather. And I found it as an interesting, very human response to caste oppression. It's not something you find in your textbooks. It's not the statistics and the numbers, but it's also very real. People found all kinds of interesting ways to respond to even inequality. And it can be fun if you start looking for these stories this way. Even something as heartbreaking as partition, Achal Malhotra, if you look at her book, she actually collects oral histories, people's memories of that. You look at Manto's short stories, they are fiction, but the short stories communicate a lot of the emotion far better than the statistics and the numbers of millions of people displaced and so on. It is the short stories that communicate the feeling of it in a much more real way. And you don't even need to fictionalize things. The record itself is inventive. The record itself is hilarious. There are all kinds of comical things in the record. As I said, I never expected Lord Curzon to be playing Lord Tennis naked as a young man in his 20s, but he did it. Or, him to admit that he'd gone to a brothel. But, these things are interesting. One letter I remember finding from this Kalidas of Kerala, this great scholar, Sanskrit Pandit, father of modern Malayalam prose literature. And in this 1870s letter, where he's a young man, he's basically talking about how he was very attached to the idea of bhang and basically how he smoked a lot of weed. And I kept thinking, Kid in his 20s in the 1870s, kid in his 20s today in the 21st century, not that much difference. Maybe they dressed differently, maybe they didn't have emails and telephones then, but the attraction towards these bhang and these small narcotics is quite interesting to find it 150 years apart. It's a very human thing.
Yeah, Idiki is still around, I'm sure. So, so why don't you take us to that point where you decided, this is what I want to make out of my life. This is going to be my career. I'm going to be a historian. How did that shift happen?
I mean, it didn't happen in a very conscious way, in the sense that, I worked on my first book. As I mean, a lot of people who work on films also know all these things are uphill tasks. It's not always, things don't just fall into place. In my case, that first book took 6 years to write, the book called The Ivory Throne, which is about these two Maharanis of Travancore and their vendetta for each other. And in those 6 years, obviously, I also had other jobs and I was studying and I did my master's and all of that. But at the end of it, the book came out and it really squeezed all the energy out of me. And 6 years had passed, but the book did well. Though it was a very hefty book, though it was on an obscure topic by an obscure writer, somehow it worked. And that gave me the confidence to consider that, hold on, maybe I can, do more of this. And I shouldn't hesitate to do more of this. So then I did Rebel Sultan, which was a shorter book written in 2 years. And again, a completely different style of writing, a completely different theme. Again, populated with lots of interesting characters, because I like telling history through the characters rather than through the abstract concepts. And that also did well. So, it sort of builds on from there. And then, of course, I did my newspaper column for 3 years. Now I'm doing my PhD, which again entails a lot of writing and research. So it's almost as though I just, slowly found myself in this path and decided I might as well stick to it. I enjoy it. People seem to be enjoying it. So fingers crossed that continues.
Fingers crossed. I hope you'll keep writing some new tales every day so that we have much more to discover about our land and our people in different ways. So I want to talk to you about The Ivory Throne. So you did mention it. It was your first book, and it was about the royals of Travancore and specifically its monarch was very interesting, Sethu Lakshmi Bai. So why don't you tell us how you discovered her story as an example for those of our people who are watching, so that they understand what it takes to really discover a character, discover a story, and then translate it into what you would imagine is a readable format.
When you're looking at especially biography, you can't approach it merely from one angle. For example, in her case, she was a ruling queen. So obviously, there was a lot of paperwork in terms of government policy, records, and so on. So obviously, you have to tap into that. You have to go to the written record to find, especially with public figures like this, you have to go to the written record to find the official story, to find the facts and the figures and all of that, because you do need that. But to discover the human side, you also have to think a little bit out of the box. For example, she only died in 1985, at the age of almost 90. And I was very curious about the fact that the last 10 years of her life, she was more or less bedridden. And this queen who ruled over millions of people, who had dealt with Edda Mussolini, Gandhi, etc. I was really curious, what did her nurses think of her in those final years? The nurses who actually bathed her, the nurses who actually helped her eat. This was a woman who lived in this ultra-Orthodox court where she had 300 servants and so on once upon a time. And then she ends up eventually in this somewhat tragic little room, one small little room in Bangalore, where her maids are Christians, who back in the day would not be allowed to come anywhere near her, let alone give her food and all that. And how did she negotiate that? And how did they view? Because they went into that house thinking, we are going to serve the queen, except the queen was this very fragile old woman who was bedridden. So it was fascinating to try and find from somebody who had worked with her what their views were of her at her weakest and towards the final years of her life. So too, it was fascinating to speak to people. There are diaries. People leave these private diaries where they're much more honest about things than they are in the official record. So, one of the things about imperialism is we think the British came here with their armies and just ruled us, with that kind of brute force. But no, knowledge is always more powerful sometimes than brute force. Intelligence gathering is always something they did. So the British were fascinating for collecting immense amounts of gossip on Indian royal families. Because the one way you can control the royal families is by knowing the Maharaja's sexual preferences, who the Maharani is sleeping with, what are the affairs that are happening in the palace, who's bribing whom. They needed to constantly, what black magic is happening, all of this they needed to know. So every 2 weeks, the Viceroy would get a report from each state about what was happening there, full of this kind of gossip. So there's already gossip in the official record. What I also found was that some of these Englishmen, they would then write the same things to their family members. So, to their mother, to their wife, etc. And these were much longer, much more honest, like much more colorful and interesting, and much more like frank about the things they had found in those 2 weeks. And those gave you a completely different insight. So you have so in her case, you have the monarch's official self-image, how she presents herself to the world in her portraits and her official pronouncements. Then you have private diaries of people in the royal family who are doing all their kitch on the side and writing what's actually happening within the royal family. You have the British collecting gossip on their own, on their own time and for themselves on the other side. And finally, you've got all these private notes and references as well. And finally, these interviews. Only by bringing together all these elements do you have something that can give you a more or less complete picture of the person. You can never completely gain a picture. It's just humanly not possible to fully decode another human being, especially after they're dead. But the closest you can come is by tapping, frankly, every source that you can find. And these sources, vary. Like you can even look at a painting of one of these Rajas and Ranis of the past. And that tells you a lot. For example, why is this particular Raja got a globe on his desk in this painting? He's trying to project some kind of modern image of himself. Look at me, I'm so aware of the world, etc. You find this in a lot of Ravi Varma paintings of these, royals from across India. He'll always have them with one hand on a stack of books. And these books are all about America and Europe and things like that. Again, trying to show that, these Indian Maharajas are totally aware of what is happening in other parts of the world. All of this is interesting material. The art is interesting, the kind of architecture and the buildings in which they lived, the paper record, the anecdotal information, all of this together, gives you a richer sense of that person. So when you're uncovering any historical figure, you have to go after all these sources, newspaper sources, for example. The more prominent the figure is, the more likely they are to appear in newspapers. So, somebody like Gandhi, not only did he write a lot himself, or even Nehru, they were also covered in the press a great deal. So you can actually trace how the public viewed them over a number of decades just by reading the press and the kind of reports that appeared on them. So that is really how you uncover a lot of these people.
Wow.
And little details and things like that. The
so how
detail is
long did
always
it
fun.
take you to do this research for the Ivory Throne? Like this seems like this could take years.
Yeah, 6 years. And in fact, even that was not enough because there was still, for example, there were these diaries written by a tutor, by an English tutor in the palace. And he had left 3 diaries of the years when she was in power. And these had somehow been auctioned in London, and I couldn't find out who had bought it. The auction house, because of their own rules, said they would forward my email to the owner, but they could not reveal who the owner was. And I waited and waited, didn't find anything, no reply. Finally, after the book came out, I finally, through another source, managed to find out and got information. And I was hitting myself on the head thinking, damn it, I should have waited another 6-7 months because I could have included that material also in the book. So, frankly, there's no end to this. Once you go down that rabbit hole, it's all consuming. So you eventually have to draw a line somewhere and say, hold on, I've ticked as many boxes as I can. Now with this material, let me try and make sense of this historical figure.
So then talk about that making sense part. Like how do you decide this is the narrative? Where does the narrative come from when you do your research and do your investigation?
So the narrative, of course, as with all storytellers, a lot of that depends on the storyteller, which is why we always say that no historical text is the truth. Everything is a retelling. Everything is a reinterpretation of existing material. You may sometimes find new material that adds something to it, but everything is somebody else retelling the story. Nobody can confirm with 100% authority and certification that, oh my God, my version is the final and the absolute version. It's simply not possible. Now, how you build your narrative also matters. For example, there was someone like Jhansi Ki Rani Lakshmibai, right? We often fall into this trap, which is a populist trap. It's a trap that's been constructed for nationalistic reasons, etc. That she was this warrior who got on a horse and fought the British. But frankly, that's just one aspect of her life. She's actually a much more remarkable person. She's, the little information we have on her shows, she was also a very intelligent woman, and intelligent not just in terms of military strategy, but arguing a legal case, for example. For the time that she was negotiating with the British for her to retain Jhansi, and which she finally lost and they didn't accept her negotiation. But that reveals that she was a woman who had a very sharp sense of intelligence and a very sort of sharp brain when it came to negotiating in legal language. She was a woman who was capable of doing something like that. So, when you see her sort of depicted as this figure who's only spouting nationalist dialogues etc. Firstly, in her context, those dialogues would not have existed because in the 19th century, it's unlikely that she would have behaved and spoken that way. Secondly, the fact of the matter is that before joining the rebels and finally sort of becoming the Jhansi Ki Rani that we know, for nearly a whole year, she did not join the rebels. She actually even criticized the rebels at first because she was negotiating with the British in that time. So if the negotiations had succeeded, there is every chance that she would not have ended up joining the rebellion. So again, there's nuance there. It's not just this story that, she was, from the time she was born as an infant and, she was always some kind of Desh Premi and then she decided to fight the British. Not true. It's just not how human beings act. Nobody is shaped that way. You are always a result and you're always a product of your circumstances, your context. So that is the other thing. You have to bring on board the context. And at the end of the day, read the historical record with an open eye. The more open you keep and the more you sort of suspend your own morality, suspend your own judgment, the more true or the more honestly you can look at these historical figures. You can see them with all their layers and in a textured sense, rather than in some kind of hackneyed sense where a queen is only a queen and you forget that she's a woman. She's a woman in a patriarchal context. She's a mother. She's a fighter. She's a politician. All of this together. There's this Gwalior ki Rani called Baizabai. And it's a fascinating story because, she wanted to control the kingdom. She was eventually pushed out of control. She tried to install a boy ruler, but then keep him as a puppet so she could hold on to power. She was also a very big banker. She had crores of rupees in the 19th century, which is 3 crores was the estimate, which is worth today's 3,000 crores really, in the 19th century. And not only did she loan this out to people, she loaned it to the East India Company. So the East India Company used to take loans from this Rani, who they eventually turned and sort of backstabbed. After she was put into exile, there is this amazing diary left behind by a lady called Fanny Parks about how she met this particular queen, who was already quite old by then. And the conversation they have is revealing about both women's mindsets and gives you a glimpse into their heads. So Baizabai meets this Fanny Parks, and she says, show me how you ride a horse. Because Baizabai was also a great rider, and even she used to go into battle decades before the Rani of Jhansi. And, Fanny Parks is fascinated, and she shows her how to ride side saddle. And Baizabai says, what is this side saddle nonsense? We don't ride like this. We Maratha women, we ride astride, like we sit on the horse like men as well. And that's how we ride. So Fanny Parks says she wants to try it as well. So the queen takes this English woman, dresses her up in the Marathi sari, the Maharashtrian, the Nawari sari, and gets her to ride a horse. And Fanny Parks is thrilled with this whole thing. Another time, there's a British Governor General who comes and the Queen wants to receive his sisters. She sends out a whole platoon of her Maratha women on horses. And there's this little detail in that account about how midway through the procession, after they'd picked up the guests, her Maratha, attendants, all of them on their horses wearing these diamonds, etc., all stopped and removed their nose rings because on the horses, the heavy nose rings were causing a tear in the nose. So they were all like, this is a hassle. So let's get rid of this before we resume our little march with the English guests. See, these are small details, but just visualize it, right? Like a procession of Maratha women in the early 19th century wearing all their traditional jewelry on horses with guns and so on, leading two English women in a procession and then stopping to take off their nose rings. It's just so remarkable to visualize something like that. And you don't have to invent this. The material is there. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a Sanjay Leela Bhansali songs. Almost sounds like a visual.
And that's what you don't even need to create it. It's there in the record. If you look for it. If you look for it.
Okay, this is very interesting that you talk about this because my next question is about rebel sultans. It's got very interesting portraits of many, many, many kingdoms, many characters. So how did you, that book also must have taken you ages to sort of conceptualize, and also because it is so readable and it's so pacey and it's so thin, you can literally skim past 400 years. So talk about that. How did you decide which characters to keep, which to junk?
The idea was, I spent 6 years on the Ivory Throne, right? So that's a 700-page immersion. With Rebel Sultan, this is the thing with writers also, right? You have to keep challenging yourself. So in the Ivory Throne, each chapter could be up to 20,000 words, which is basically a master's thesis length. That's how much each chapter was, and there are about 20 chapters in the book. So, it's a huge enterprise. So I wanted to try and see if I could do cover a larger space. So Ivory Throne is one character's lifespan, really.
Yeah.
And that's 700 pages that it occupies.
Yeah.
I wanted to do the opposite now, cover a larger number of centuries in a fewer number of pages to see if I could keep a story going without having to go into that kind of immersion. And that's what I tried to do with Rebel Sultans, which is the history of the Deccan. But there again, the idea is to, between all the battles and the decapitated heads and the cut off arms and the mutinies and the assassinations, there are these interesting figures. Again, the idea is to bring history alive through the eyes of the historical figures who were in that story. So, for instance, my two favorite characters in the book, Ibrahim Adil Shah II of Bijapur, this man who wore red nail polish, this Sultan. He was a Sunni Muslim, but he also called himself son of Saraswati and Ganapati. His predecessors were Shia. He's decided to become Sunni. So he's already, mixing up things a little bit. He, like Akbar, he is a contemporary of Akbar. Like Akbar has his Fatehpur Sikri, Ibrahim has his Nauruzpur. Like Akbar has his Dini Elahi, and he has his meetings with Jains and Christians and all kinds of intellectuals. Ibrahim has his meetings with all kinds of intellectuals. And a man who was, a great patron of the arts, a great patron of music, of all kinds of talents. One, Dutchman or a foreign trader came to see him and found him sitting in the midst of 500 bejeweled women playing their veenas. Again, a very visual scene. And this is an actually recorded, piece of history. And this man did all kinds of comical things. The Mughals once wanted his daughter. He had to come to terms with the Mughals, and they wanted his daughter to be given to the Mughal harem. And what was interesting is, he said, fine, send your ambassador. But he didn't want his daughter to go to the Mughal court. So what he did was he bribed the ambassador for 2 years, simply kept giving him money to stay put and not finish the treaty, not finish the deal. So for 2 years, this is going on. The ambassador is not bringing back any princess. Akbar gets really frustrated and sends another ambassador saying, you spend only one night in Ibrahim's capital, not more than that. Again, Ibrahim is shrewder than the ambassador. 2 weeks before the ambassador gets there, he says, stop. I'm too busy, so I can't receive you. And then he bombards the ambassador with biryani, dancing girls, conversationalists, ministers, just to distract him. When he gets to, Bijapur, he tries to bribe him. Then, when he finally has no option but to give the princess, and they have to leave, there's a badge that the ambassador wears given to him by the emperor. Ibrahim says, let me look at that, and takes the badge and refuses to give it back. Now, the ambassador is stuck because he has to obey the emperor's command and not stay in Bijapur for more than one night.
Wow.
Equally, he can't return to the Mughal court without the badge because that's an insult to the emperor. So then again, time is wasted because he's negotiating for the return of his badge. So these stalling tactics are fascinating to sort of imagine happening in the 17th century by the Sultan who's got Maratha blood, Persian blood, calls himself son of Saraswati, also is a practicing Sunni Muslim, is intellectually inclined, all of this. So too the African general Malik Akbar. We in Maharashtra, we talk a lot about Chhatrapati Shivaji. Chhatrapati Shivaji is famous for bringing the Marathas into sovereign power. But the process was actually started under an African general. And I've always thought that episode is great for a movie because you have Ibrahim Adil Shah, this half Persian, half Maratha king in Bijapur. You've got Malik Akbar, who's African and gets his African daughter married to the Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar. And the Nizam Shah, in turn, is a Shia Muslim of Brahmin descent who has wives who are not only Persian but also Africans. Now, growing up, have we ever visualized in an Indian city African queens to Indian kings? Not really, but it happened. But it exists.
Wow.
So these stories and the idea of an African general leading the Marathas against the Mughals, I find it a completely riveting thing. And his right-hand man was a man called Maloji Bhosle, who was none other than Shivaji's grandfather. So the connections exist. It's just, we are never taught when we picture the Mughal invasion of the Deccan, we think, okay, Shivaji fought them. But a few decades before Shivaji, an African man fought them, surrounded by these Marathas. And Shivaji was, gave a lot of respect to Malik Akbar. In court poetry, he flatters Malik Akbar as brave as the sun, compares him to Kartikeya, the Hindu god. Shivaji actually pays tribute to Malik Akbar, but we don't learn about Malik Akbar. So there's cinematic quality, of course, in a lot of these stories, but the stories are rich in their own right. These characters are rich, interesting characters. Malik Akbar was originally a slave. He was enslaved in Ethiopia, sold in Baghdad, and then brought to the Deccan. To rise from there to becoming a kingmaker in the Deccan, to get the daughter of a slave to marry a king in India, all of this is just fascinating stories. It challenges a lot of cliches we have about history. If you go into these individual stories, you discover that history can surprise you, and it's not really always what your textbook reduces it to.
That's true. I mean, we can actually go on and just get Manu to talk about all these interesting characters from history and how he just remembers like these vivid details in so much detail. It's insane. But before we open the floor for questions from the audience, because I know everybody has a lot to ask you, I just want to ask you one elemental question, which is about research. As wide and interesting a country as India is, because India is a collection of cultures, right, with different languages, different nuances. What is the biggest challenge for a historian in 21st century India?
You know, all historians, as far as possible, need to go back to the primary material, which is the actual historical evidence. Now, the problem in a diverse country like ours, especially if you're trying to zoom out and do, say, South Indian history or North Indian history, is the number of languages. How many languages can you learn? I can do Hindi, I can do Marathi, I can do Malayalam, I can do English. But if I've got, when I was doing the Deccan book, there's also Telugu material in it. What do I do about Telugu? You end up relying on translations. But there you can choose wisely. You can choose the latest translation done by a scholar who's established in the field. So, you know, Velicheru Narayana Rao in the case of Telugu has been working on that language for decades. So you can trust that translation. It's not ideal, but it has to be done because we have far too many languages. In France, if you're doing a history of France, you're dealing with one language, perhaps a few different dialects, but one language. So we, on the other hand, have to jump several loops and try and get all of these different cultures and different, you know, perspectives on board. It's not impossible, but it's slightly different from how, for example, it's done in Europe, where you have nation states organized around one language as opposed to ours. The other is also material, right? As I said earlier, there's this orthodox old behavior, which is to think that history is written only in the records. Now, firstly, in a country like ours, where literacy was only in the hands of the elites, the Brahmins and maybe a few other upper castes, for example, or a few royal courts, it's a very elitist thing to look only at written records. The stories of the masses are often written in song, in folklore, in local mythology. Now, for example, a mythology or a myth, you're not actually saying whether the question is not whether the myth is true or false. The question to ask is, what is this myth trying to communicate to me? Why was this myth created? What is the intention? What is this trying to communicate? The creation of the myth is sometimes more interesting than the myth itself in a historical sense. So too, you look at art. You know, when you're studying Tipu Sultan, it's not just his imperial edicts. You also go to his palace in Srirangapatna and look at the mural paintings that he's created there. And you have this fascinating mural where he's defeating an English army. And he's shown in the middle of this carnage, you know, lopped off heads and cut off arms. He's sitting on a horse, regally smelling a rose, looking as though he's in a garden. And he's depicted the English colonel in a palanquin, which is supposed to suggest unmanly, you know, behavior, chewing his nails. It's a painting, it's not a written record, but it's also trying to communicate a political message. It's also trying to communicate a historical message. So historians have to bring on board all these things. You have to bring on board art, literature, music, myth, oral history, written records, all of this together to get something that resembles the truth. You can never fully get the truth, but you know, you can get as close as possible by covering as large a ground in terms of your source material.
Okay, that's quite interesting though. But I just wanted to ask you, like when you mentioned translations, right? Do you take then translations in the English language, or would you like go for a translation, say, of a Telugu text in Malayalam? Is that a better way?
No, the thing is, I'm writing, I mean, that's interesting because, you know, how it gets translated into each language varies, right? Because sometimes some languages have words that are far more suitable for translation than others. For example, Indian languages and South Indian languages of the same Dravidian family may actually have the words already, may have the vocabulary to translate more easily. Whereas sometimes if you translate into English, the power or the beauty sometimes goes. Because the English language is in many ways alien and it doesn't, it's not good enough for sometimes communicating that perfectly. Expert translators manage. But the thing is, because I work in English, it's better for me to stick to English language translations because I write in English. That's the simple fact of it.
Okay, great. I'm going to keep asking you my own questions in between some audience questions now, which I'm going to ask you.
Sure.
One of the viewers has asked you how much does technology in specifically apps like Binge Plus, do you know of Binge Plus?
No.
It is even I don't know. It's an Android set-top box that gives access to all apps in one place, helping content creators. This is very specific. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Maybe we didn't understand the question itself. So sorry. Maybe you can explain to us what Binge Plus is and if it has anything to do with history that might make it more specific. So the next question is, while writing the character sketches of historical non-fiction characters, how do you stick with the essence of the character as information is often more taken from multiple sources?
No, because I mean, even so, historians are trained even to deal with conflicting sources. Now, for example, if you look at the history of the city of Hyderabad, there is this enduring legend that Hyderabad was named after a courtesan the king fell in love with called Bhagmati. And it was first called Bhagnagar. Now, it's interesting. Now, the question is not whether it's true or false. The question is, why is the story there? Like, why is any legend created? Why is any myth created? That is what you ask. So, firstly, did Bhagmati exist? Look at the evidence. So, the Mughals in the same time have this one line where a Mughal governor sitting slightly far away says, the city is named after a hardened whore. Pardon my French, but that's the actual quote. So, the Mughals are saying the city is named after a whore. At the same time, you look at the other evidence. The king who established the city, he has written a literary work of his own Kuliyat. And in that, he's listed all his favorite wives. And there is no Bhagmati in it. So, so it's interesting, right? If he's named an entire city after his beloved, why does she not exist in a list that has all his wives? Isn't that an interesting conundrum? All the same, why did the Mughals say the city is named after a hardened whore? This is where the historian has to read between the lines. Now, the Mughals are an enemy of the king of Hyderabad. They have an interest in playing down anything done in Hyderabad. Now, the numismatic evidence does not suggest it was ever called Bhagnagar. It was always called Hyderabad or Golconda. Golconda because of the fort. Yes. Hyderabad after Hyder, of Islamic tradition, not of any Bhagmati or whatever. The coinage does not refer to Bhagnagar. So the chances, and this was a courtly, so there's this whole thing called courtly insults. So, kings in the past, if they had enemies, had this whole tradition of insulting the other kings. And it was sometimes used to check the strength of the other king. So if you sent an insult, that's why you have all these Akbar and Birbal stories, stories of kings insulting each other, because the kings are trying to test how powerful the enemy is. So you send a word that can have double meanings, for example, or you send a letter that could be construed as an insult. How that king responds gives you a sense of, how strong that king is. One of the Vijayanagara emperors even told one of the Adil Shahs of Bijapur, I'll give you back your territory I've conquered if you come and kiss my feet. And, and this is an actual historical thing. And the Adil Shah was weak. He couldn't, say, buzz off to the Vijayanagara emperor who had already defeated him. So he said, oh, your highness, I would totally do it. But as a king, I cannot enter foreign territory, so I can't come to your court and kiss your foot. He didn't say, I won't kiss your foot. He said, I can't come there because foreign territory. He's trying to put draw the ball back into his court, which Vijayanagar is keeping in its court. So all of these courtly insults are also negotiated. So to go back to Hyderabad, the Mughals have an incentive. When an enemy king has created this flashy new city, everybody's talking about it. Hyderabad is being praised by poets and all that. The Mughals have an interest in playing it down. Perhaps the king had some lover or whatever, but to create this myth that it was named after the king's whore is a Mughal take on something. The king's record itself personally does not have the name Bhagmati. It does not have the name Bhagnagar, which leads you to believe that no, this legend is probably a creation of the Mughals to diss the city, to diss the capital of the enemy king, rather than the enemy king actually setting up a city named after a courtesan. So, and Hyderabad was later conquered by the Mughals. So even if today Hyderabadis themselves believe the story, it's partly because the Mughals conquered it and they perpetuated the story.
Yeah.
So, historians are trained to sort of question the sources itself and try and reach certain conclusions.
So that also means that you must keep reading, huh?
A lot.
Read. Okay. Okay, the next question is, while sketching a historical character and writing that person's story, what is the point wherein you stop and say, fine, I'm convinced there are no more leads. Now I have to employ a bit of fiction and there is nothing to feel guilty about.
No, I've never employed fiction because I found that, there is enough usually to figure this out. Enough usually to find it. I mean, the closer the historical figures are to our time, the more material there is. You just have to know where to look for that material. If you go to the standard biographies and standard books, you only get limited material. You have to also think of the world around that ruler. So if a particular ruler of a particular historical figure existed here, don't just look for things on them. Look at the political context around them. Look at the cultural context around them. And you find stray references here and there which give you other leads. That's how you build the story. So, if you're talking about a Rani of Jhansi, you have to also talk about the British relationship with the princely states at that time. You have to also talk about her friends, the people she grew up with who also ended up fighting in the rebellion. You have to also talk about the Peshwa who was exiled from Pune to Banaras because she grew up, not Banaras, sorry, another place, but she grew up in that Peshwa's court. So you have to try and find all of this, because here and there, scattered in the historical record, you'll find different kinds of needs. And some characters certainly, if you go back 1,000 years, you will not find this kind of information. There is more fictionalization. There is more speculation. There is more, theorization of how this person might have behaved and so on. But I personally work closer to our time. I work mostly in the colonial period. That is the period I cover. And I find that if you know where to look, there's plenty of evidence.
Has it ever happened to you that, I know that that's how Ivory Throne, that's one of the stories of how Ivory Throne came up, but have you ever been accosted by some interesting characters, especially maybe in places like Delhi, political circles, saying that I have one family who has very interesting story, and made you sit and listen to it endlessly?
This has happened. People, once you write about one thing, anything vaguely connected to it, people try to get you to take an interest in it. And I see why, because we have so many untold stories in our country. It's really quite sad that we don't have enough storytellers going out and looking for these stories, because they exist. There are so many remarkable characters. There are so many remarkable stories. And sometimes the thing is, lack of access alone prevents their stories from being told. Think of it this way. Even in a socio-political thing, we have more about kings and queens, but we don't have enough about the common people. Why? Because from the 19th century onwards, we've stressed looking for records. And we've forgotten to look at songs. We forgot to look at when I keep thinking, when I go to Kerala, for example, in my ancestral place, there are these fields around. And I've been trying to find an older person from the community that did the actual tilling to tell me some of their harvest songs. They don't remember, because the thing is, nobody valued it. They themselves moved on and moved on to other professions, etc. And those songs are lost. But in those songs, their histories were recorded. Their famous characters, their heroes, people who were icons in that community, poor communities, marginalized communities, but their stories existed. But because we've never made the effort to codify or to write down those stories, more and more of that is lost, because it's not written down, because it's in the realm of orality. It's in the realm of song and lore, rather than written down material. And that is a real tragedy. It's the same, even leaving aside the social inequality of it, even geography can matter. If you're sitting on a bunch of documents 500 miles away from the closest big city, chances of somebody coming there and giving value to those documents is lower than chances if you were closer to the city. If you had some kind of access to people who would be interested in it. But yeah, India has no dearth of stories, and I hope a lot of filmmakers, if they're watching this, actually go looking for some of these stories.
You can maybe connect them to some of the people who've asked you to do biographies. Okay, so we have a very interesting question from Shruti Madhu from Thrissur. She's asked, it's indeed quite interesting to hear that even history is not the ultimate truth. However, I'm prompted to ask, what do you think about history being narrated differently according to hegemonic ideological systems?
That always happens. So the thing is, I've found one way to frame this in recent times, which is that you go back, say, to the early 20th century. There were these giants of Indian history at that time called Jadunath Sarkar, G.S.R. Desai, etc., Raghubir Singh. They were very close to each other. They were the Pune school of historians. A lot of them their contributions are very valuable, at their time, in their context, with the evidence available. And these people literally, there was no Google, there were no online catalogs, there were no library catalogs. In Jadunath Sarkar's case, etc., they actually had to go to places, climb hills, find little homes, find the little documents in those homes, and then publish them, which people like me today can use. So their contributions are very real. But yes, they worked within a framework which was not just a colonial framework, it was also a highly patriarchal framework. So if you expect Jadunath Sarkar's history books to give you an equitable perspective in terms of gender, if you expect a feminist perspective in Jadunath Sarkar's work, you're not going to find it, because feminism was not even conceptually a thing in his head when he was working. So that hegemonic or that impulse of patriarchy was so strong and so ingrained that you can't expect feminism out of his books. So too, today no historian can ignore feminist perspectives. And I've done that in The Ivory Throne, for example. You see a very strong feminist streak throughout the book because you can't ignore it. Once it opens your eyes, it's very difficult to ignore that with any kind of history writing. But we have our own blinkers. So my theorization is that 30, 40 years from now, we will be judged by future historians for not bringing on board an LGBT perspective. Because again, it's not that these don't exist.
Yes.
There's a book by Madhavi Menon who talks about temple legends in India, mythology in India, which is full of homoerotic, suggestions, etc. So that's not very obvious, but it's an interesting lead because she's one of the first people to go down that route. We don't know enough, but now that she's alerted us to it, more and more people will slowly start going into that field. And 30, 40 years from now, a lot of things we study about society, the organization of social classes, etc., will be informed not just by feminist gender theory, but also by queer theory. And that is something that will be used as a critique against my generation of historians because it's not evolved enough yet for us to currently bring it into our work. It's a work in progress. So we will also be critiqued in future because we are working within a certain framework that has its own weaknesses. That's how history evolves. It evolves and changes with each generation, frankly. And it's not a good or bad thing. History, as I said earlier, is a retelling. It's always a retelling. And the question is, you have to try as far as possible to keep your retelling up to date with whatever's happening in terms of perspectives and academic findings, etc. And you do your best. And in future, somebody else will retell it in a new way.
That's what's fascinating about history. It can be retold every few years and reinterpreted every few years. And that's what's exciting.
And that's how it should be.
That's how it should be. We have a very interesting specific question from Krupa from Bangalore, who's asked, legally, do you have to take permission or are there any restrictions to get your hands on their material for investigation?
So this is, it depends. For example, when I was working in the Ivory Throne, which is about one of these royal families, that family has two branches. So one branch, the head of which happens to end up looking villainous in the book, not because of my choosing, but because that's how the evidence shows that person. Their descendants were obviously very unhappy with my line of research, and they did not cooperate. So I did not get access to their private material. The other branch was more than happy. So it's true, that does create that one missing piece in the puzzle because you haven't managed to get complete access. But legally, no, not really. In fact, a legal challenge was attempted, but I'm not pulling anything out of thin air. I'm pulling things out of the archives. I'm pulling things out of public records. I'm going, it may be in America, Britain, and India. It may be in the National Archives in Delhi, the Kerala Archives, the British Archives, but these are all public archives. So I am not saying it. These are written records. Your own ancestors have signed these papers. Your own ancestors have sent these documents to government authorities. So I cannot be held responsible because I am not saying categorically that this is my view of what happened. No, I'm using the historical evidence to say this is what the evidence suggests. And, quote copiously, and nobody can really stand in your way. That said, sometimes there's that thin line between what is libel and what is honest reporting. So in the Ivory Throne, for example, there was a lot of sensitive material I came across, which I didn't include in the book. Because it did not feel, in my mind, it did not have a direct bearing on the historical side that I was researching. It was entirely private, and it did not, there's no need, unless I wanted to make the book unnecessarily salacious, I would not have included it. I could have included it because it's in an archive and nobody can stop me, but it made no relevance to include it to the story. And there I thought, why unnecessarily upset people? For me, they're historical characters. For this person, it's grandmother or grandfather, and I should not, if I can avoid it, I should not include ultra-sensitive personal things, which have no bearing on the historical story. That is just their personal thing. So tomorrow if somebody's researching me, for example, there's a certain amount of stuff they can, use, for example, if I die and they want to research, they can read whatever I've written, etc., and come to conclusions. But there's also a line, for example, between, something that happened, say, to somebody in my family in some tragic situation. That has no business making into it because it does not directly affect. I mean, you have to tread carefully over there in terms of gauging how much of that you should involve and how much of that you should not. Because at the end of the day, human beings, people's feelings, etc. The feelings you should definitely not care much about is the so-called hurt sentiments in a public sense, because that is usually not intelligent people. That is usually people looking for attention from the press who come and tear things or burn books and break up film sets and so on, which is just for attention. And if you give into that once, they will keep doing it. It becomes a formula for anybody who wants attention. That you should never give into. Other things which are sensitive, you can handle it in a sensitive way, even if you must present it. If you present it in context, if you present it in a way where your language is not, egging on some kind of provocative thing, where you're sensitizing the reader as well as yourself to that sensitive material, That is, I think, the mature way to go about it.
Wow, that's a great lesson. So one last question before we wrap this up. What are you working on next?
So, I have the superstition, which is never to talk about what's coming up till it's done. So I'm very, very orthodox about these things. It's just a lifelong habit. Never talk about something till it's done. So when it's done, by the end of this year, you'll probably know what it is.
So guys, by the way, Manu did confess that he's had a very productive 2020. So we can expect lots.
Well. I said too much. That was a private chat.
Okay. And what about the PhD that you're doing? Do you want to talk to us about that?
I mean, PhD, unfortunately, academic writing is rather, boring. And that's something I can't say I enjoy doing, but, one does it. And there, of course, your language doesn't need to be elegant. Your language just needs to be direct and communicative. So that kind of writing is completely, let's say, unanimated writing. It's you could sort of shut your eyes and do that kind of writing because it's far to the point. And that's ongoing, but I'm more interested in the books I'm producing than in the thesis I'm producing. I'll confess that much.
That's great to hear. That's only good news for us as readers. So thank you so much, Manu, for this very, very helpful and incredibly useful session for all our viewers and for me as well. I've learned so much more about things that didn't make it to the print, so that's good for me. You should also know that my favorite book by Manu is this one, The Courtesan, The Mahatma, and The Italian Brahmin. It has 61 incredible short stories of very, very interesting people and very colorful people from all across India. And you can literally pick it up and read one story and forget about it and pick it up, read about another story, and your mind just keeps going like, wow, I think it's books like these that help us understand our culture a bit more, and also like really throws light on, all the things that people don't necessarily talk about in modern popular culture because our attention spans are so limited. So this is like that perfect companion novel to understand history. So I encourage everybody to read it. One last question before we completely say bye. There's this one thing that you had mentioned in the introduction. We live in times when history is polarizing. It has become to some an instrument of vengeance for grievances imagined or real. So when you read this line and you think about the current context, about the India we live in today and how everything is the Mughals' fault, how do you as a historian react to that?
There are two ways. I've seen a lot of my friends, for example, on social media especially, get into these arguments saying, no, this was wrong and this is not how it was and you're misreading things. My attitude is slightly different, which is that once you go down the path, which is the path they want, with people who pick these unnecessary fights, these unhistorical, unscholarly, and unintelligent fights, frankly, they pick it because they want you to come down to those terms, which I don't think is the way to fight that or to sort of challenge that. The answer to that is to highlight more stories, is to tell more stories, because those stories, let the listener make up their mind. We should not get into this little tiff. We should highlight more of history as it is, more of history as it has been found to the best of our capacity and communicate to larger audiences, because then the people themselves will realize, people who are sort of watching this themselves will realize, hold on, this whole idea that everything that the Mughals did was wrong, etc. Firstly, I find that really sexist, right? I mean, the whole idea that the Mughals are foreigners in this country, I'm sorry, several of them were sons of Hindu Rajput princesses. Are you completely negating the fact that their mothers had some role to play in their lives? Why doesn't the mother side of the heritage count at all? Does everything have to depend on the father? All of these questions exist. So half of these battles come with political purposes. I think it's wiser for historians not to engage on those political terms, but to remain on the historical turf, but to make that history more communicative, tell more stories, reveal more stories from the past, light up the room, let more people engage with history. And that, I think, will set the record straight instead of picking fights and wrestling with the pig, because only the pig enjoys it.
On that note, thank you so much, Manu S. Pillai, for your generous time. And for you guys watching, you can definitely find this talk once it's not live also. You can watch it as history. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Arun. Thank you. Pleasure being here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Are we offline?
There we are. We are. Well, almost. Sharon, thanks so much. That was absolutely amazing. I hope you had a good time. Sharon, Did you enjoy yourself?
Yes. I always enjoy myself.
Is Manu still with us? Manu, can you see me?
Yes, I'm still here.
Manu, did you have fun?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
I'm so glad. Okay, wonderful. Thank you guys so much for being part of India Film Project Season 10. This is the first time we're ever doing this virtually, and we are absolutely thrilled that you guys are part of it. So thank you so much. Like you said, Sharon, in the beginning, I'm sure this would be amazing with a live audience, but you know what? We hope that that can happen soon. So thank you both so very much.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
a
you,
lot.
guys.
Thank you, Kate.
Guys, before we slip into a little bit of, a blank before we reach our next session, let me tell you that the hashtag My Reason to Create contest is on. And if you'd like to go to the live feed tab and basically Acer Concept D creators want you to share the reason of what drives you to create. So personally, as you watch this, what drives you to create? Put the hashtag My Reason to Create and drop it in the live feed. Lots of things to be won. Also, if you go to the contest tab, your black and white OnePlus story, all right? Hashtag your B&W OnePlus story. Click a black and white picture, whatever you're doing right now with a suitable caption, upload it on that contest tab, tag OnePlus, and which really, really resonates with their brand identity, which is never settle. Please put it up there in the contest tab. Big thank you again to Sharon and Manu. We have our next session starting at 7:45. Yeah, 45. Okay, great. I got that right. 7:45. Our prize partner is Aperture. Our media partner is Array. Our magazine partner is Better Photography. One last thing before I switch this off. You can visit the Friends of IFP and interact with our sponsors and partners. So for those of you watching this, if you want to get yourself some cool products, some cool gear, Friends of IFP, the tab that you can see below, go check them out. They've got a lot to offer. Best part, you get discounted products. It's unbelievable. If you're a person who wants to pick up stuff, go right ahead to the Friends of IP tab and pick up your stuff right now. All right. My name is Kay. I'm going to call this a cut right here. We'll see you for the next session on stage 2. Bye-bye.
Are we offline?
I hope so.
I think so.
Yeah,
Okay,
now nobody's replying to us. So we must.
Guys, can you hear me?
Okay, thanks.
Guys, can you hear me?
Yes.